Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Influence Economy podcast. I'm your host, Shayna Davis, and I'm so glad that you're here today. But before we get started, I would love if you would do me a favor. So, wherever it is that you are listening to this episode, I want you to take a screenshot. And with that screenshot, I want you to post it on LinkedIn, tag me at Shayna Rattler Davis, and then I just want to hear your biggest aha moment or your biggest takeaway from this episode. And the reason why I do that is I just think that far too many tech leaders nowadays don't really know how to cultivate and build the external presence that the new world demands. And so the more times that we share these episodes, the more of them will actually be exposed to the signals that they need to develop in order to be able to lead better. So I appreciate you in advance for being willing to do that. I'm going to read my guest's bio and I'm going to get into what I just have a feeling is going to be a great conversation. There's a lot of synergy between what we do. So here we go. My guest today is the founder and CEO of Prepare for VC, an investor readiness firm that has helped early stage founders raise more than $480 million in capital. He is also a venture investor through EQX, Fund and Equity Venture Partners. He's chapter director of Startup Grind Boston, and he's also the author of Venture Forward Lessons from Leaders. Drawing on experience as both an entrepreneur and investor, he helps founders sharpen their strategy, strengthen their leadership, and navigate the path from idea to scalable venture. I'm excited to welcome to the show Jason Kraus.
Thanks for having me, Shayna. Yeah, it's great to
Yeah.
be here.
I'm glad to have you here. You know, you and I do very similar work, but not necessarily from the same angle. So I love being able to kind of talk shop with people who I feel like I say finally get it. And
Yeah.
so I'm excited to have this conversation. When I was doing my research for this episode, I see that you say that you bet on the jockey. And so I would love for you to describe, number one, what exactly do you mean by that? And how do you evaluate a jockey that you've never heard of versus one that already has visible market credibility going in?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I think um, it is a mix of both. There's founders taken bets on that have had proven startup success, and that's their um kind of entry point or leg up in the next venture is, hey, we know how to lead a business, we know the industry in and out. But then there's the other side of, like, how are they running and organizing, if this is even their first venture. And so, one example with the EQX fund we have is, there are a lot of serial entrepreneurs, but there's also one of the founders we invested in early on. Her name Laura Taylor from Candidly, and it's a student debt repayment platform. And like when we went in, she told her story, got us excited about it. But when we went into due diligence, she had like the most organized pipeline and like knew where everybody was, what their probability of closing, and was able to say how this would lead into, other companies and businesses that would join as well, and had a really clear story and framework, and we could just see, like, she would figure it out one way or another.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, some of it's things like that of it is a lot of time, it's a couple conversations, you're trying to figure out like how this person's going to lead the next 5, 6, 7 years of their business. And so, it's as much of those insights you can get early on. And that's also something we work with our founders on Prepare for VC, is like, you don't have to accept everyone's advice either, but if you can show, you're taking everyone's feedback, you're coachable, and you're also able to come back to them and say, hey, we went through it, and this is why we're going a different direction, or this is why, we're planning what you said in the second phase of our business. It's just showing, like, you can take in a lot of information, figure out how to deal with it, and at some point, every startup makes some sort of change or pivot, like
Yeah.
big or small, and it's being adaptable and, showing that you can be resilient through all that as well.
Yeah, one of the hills that I'm willing to die on is that the best tech doesn't always win, but I do believe that oftentimes the founder and the team that is actually demonstrating credibility outside of the company is what wins, because there was a time in in the world where if you had strong tech and you had a great team, that was all it took to win. But nowadays when you look up and every 3 hours someone is coming out with something that seemingly is the exact same as what it is that you've built, or there is no bad tech ideas, and the tech is going to shift 3 months after you start building it or whatever. Oftentimes it comes down to how well are the founder and especially their core leadership team, how well are they actually representing themselves and the company with trust and credibility? Are they able to? I was in a conversation with some investors at a conference earlier this year, and we were having this conversation, and they were saying nowadays there are no bad ideas that come to us. Everyone has brilliant ideas for the tech, but we're looking for, why is the founder doing this? Do they have some level of idea of like where their industry is headed, and a distinct point of view on what they think is missing in the industry and what the industry is going to have to include in order for it to get where they're going? Because like yourself, it's not necessarily the tech always that they're betting on, and the tech is going to evolve after they get the money anyway. And so they say they actually don't invest in any company that they don't feel like the founder themselves can tell a good story, can represent themselves well when the media comes knocking, and all the things that are going to come down the road kind of after your go to market is over. So I'm curious, when you think about the deals that you've seen, have you ever passed on a deal that like the tech was strong, the numbers and the metrics was there, but there was something about how the founder presented themselves that just kind of made you hesitate?
Yeah, and it depends on, the startup and the sector as well. There's some businesses like, and what's gonna be the secret to making the business successful? If it's a marketing heavy industry, they have to show they can actually create a really strong brand, and that's even more important for the founder to tell a really amazing story, get people excited about it. And when you look at their website and social media, like those are more important. It's always important, but even more so on those types of companies where it's a consumer product. It's even like a freemium platform that you need a large user base, So we want to see like they're able to market and get people excited about this. When it's more of a med device healthcare application, still it's more about the story of the founder is an expert in their space and they know how to, talk to or get physicians excited, and you can see them like going one by one and, getting a room full of people rather than, having a huge maybe someday they have a huge social media presence, but it's more like, can this be a speaker at a med device conference? Can this be somebody that can go in a room and, talk to physicians and get them interested in what they're doing. And so a little bit different depending on the type of company, but the storytelling and how it plays into their roadmap is really essential.
And is that one of the things that you actually evaluate before you decide to take a meeting, or is it something that you wait? Well, let me ask you this. If someone is pitching you, if they're pitching your company, what work do you do? What kind of pre-work do you do before you decide to give them a meeting versus what you may do afterwards? So you're talking about, like, do they have the ability to represent themselves well on an industry panel, or if the media is interviewing them, or, the story that you see themselves telling on their social media? How important is that for you when you're evaluating whether or not you're even going to entertain a meeting with them versus those are the types of things that you may look for maybe longer down the road?
Yeah. The first, I would say like there's a few phases of every um investment cycle. The first piece is get it, can we get excited about this? And then
Hmm.
it's can we poke holes and de-risk? And so the first phase is like, have they shown enough in whatever introduction, whether it's, an email, LinkedIn, like applying through, an application or getting referred in. Is there enough there that says, this is actually a really exciting idea? They have the right background for it, and that's important. Do they have that founder market fit? And then yeah, and then from there, it's hearing the whole pitch, hearing the story, and then saying, is this a company? We don't have unlimited time. If is this a company, like if I'm going to spend time on, the next three businesses in our due diligence, like is that one of the top ones I'm seeing now that we're going to move into the next phase and, see if everything checks out and if we're going to de-risk, like is everything they're saying um, both truthful from the founder's perspective and also like when we do our own research and look at the competitive analysis and analyze how we see their company growing and the industry growing, does everything still make sense?
Yeah. So, what would you say is one of the most common reasons that you see founders get rejected? Because obviously, everyone's not getting a yes.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is everybody has a different, I mean, there's a lot of trends, but there's thousands of funds and individual investors because it's not all the same thesis on like what makes a great startup. And
Hmm.
so, um, if everybody had the same exact thesis, there would just be one giant fund and everybody would put money in there. But yeah, so I think, on my end, like we put a lot more weight on the some of the like soft skills we were talking or power skills we were talking about before, like the adaptability and um, especially their skill set in the industry, their ability to bring other team members and surround themselves with the right people and not need to be like the smartest person in the room. They can say, yeah, I learned from our COO, and I learned from this advisor that we brought on and, went through a program where we learned X, Y, and Z. Um, all of that shows like, they're willing to go out there and get all the experience they need to make this successful. But there's other investors that say you need to go to a specific, you need to go to an Ivy League school and fit a
Hmm.
specific mold. There's others that look for something completely different, or they do put the product before the team, and yeah. So I believe it is the team and the people first, and especially now where there's going to be, I mean, it's easier than ever to get started, harder. It's not always easier to scale, but assume every company is going to have some sort of competitor because there's just going to be so many new businesses. So that's why I think the team is even more essential than ever.
You talked about investors having a different thesis, like they're all looking for something different. They all have, what they different things that they think a founder should focus on, et cetera. What is some of the advice that you see founders receiving as it pertains to becoming ready to pitch, becoming ready for investments that you disagree with? You don't have to call any
Yeah,
names.
yeah. Yeah, I think I mean there's yeah, different perspectives on like how much you should predict out. And I always like or even like let's say, a pre-seed round, are you showing your projections for the next 5 years? Are you saying, these are our exit pathways? I actually like, to see that because it's not it's not necessarily, we're gonna hold this founder to hitting their year three revenue and selling to these companies, but it's saying, do you believe this business can scale in the right way? Do you know how you're going to spend the capital you're asking for and how it can translate into revenue going forward? And it's more like the mindset and
Yeah.
the, thought process. And also, on the exit side, even though it's, far, far away, it's also like, have you thought if this business was in the hands of other companies, how massive a reach could they have and how would they be able to use the platform you've created and are going to create? So I think, yeah, kind of thinking through like more of the process rather than just, only focusing on what's there today,
Yeah.
helps you get the whole like picture and story.
I'm glad that you mentioned, sometimes not putting as much weight on like the down the road projections, et cetera, because as business owners, we're really creating in a vacuum in terms of oftentimes what we think is going to happen down the road. And you don't really know what's going to be happening in year three until you see what some of the factors are in year one and year two. Like you're making your best guess. There's things that you're going to plan for, there's things that you're going to do strategically, but you honestly have no idea what's going to happen in the future until you get going, and you're just getting started. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I had a Series A fintech founder that I was working with, and I was looking at his deck and I asked him why he didn't have any section in there at all with projections. And he said, and I'm not going to quote because the words that he said were a lot more colorful than this, but he basically was like, because all those numbers that people put in there are bullshit. He said, basically, people are inflating the numbers based on what it is that they think investors want to see. And I think it's all bullshit. And I'm not going to put that in there. That's just not how I sell. I would much rather focus on what it is that we're building and why it matters now and how it's going to revolutionize the industry from an impact perspective and bring in investors that agree with that than shooting some numbers of what I think it's going to be in year three, year five, year 10. And most of that is obviously going to be inflated as well. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's where I like the conviction of the founder. I think if they can answer like the question it's really asking, which is um, why should the investor go in today versus wait until the next round? And
Yeah.
you can do it by showing the numbers and saying, um, this is what we're doing today, or, we're launching our product and, at the next round we can get to this specific milestone and be worth, two or three times what we are today. You can tell it in more of a story way without the numbers, but as long as you answer that main question of, why is this round of investors going to be better off than the next round? And, given the risk, it has to be a good enough jump to, go in before everything is de-risked. And then ultimately, everybody's still like that jump is still on paper, so it's still about, the whole vision and is this a long-term opportunity? But yeah, basically answering the why now, both from the financial perspective as well as like the other part of that story is, why is this business possible now that nobody could have created this or why doesn't it exist already is always, another question that should be part of the story as well.
Yeah. Last thing I want to ask you about before we begin to wrap up is that I'm seeing a lot of questions being asked and conversations being had around is there still oodles and oodles of capital that is being invested? And I know that money is still being given in a downturn, if you will. But I also believe that investors are maybe being a little more discerning. Even if you look at corporate contracts, if you look at how money is being spent, money is obviously still being spent, but I do think that people are maybe being a little more discerning about how they're spending money and where they're spending money. So in your opinion, when we're in somewhat of a downturn, what separates a founder who gets funded during that period of uncertainty, if you want to call it that, versus one that doesn't?
Sure. Yeah. So, we've worked with startups all over. I'm in Boston, and it tends to be a little bit more conservative versus, like the Silicon Valley areas. And I think what shifted for especially the early stage is, more emphasis on can this funding round get you to a more profit or closer to profitability. And the next round is really for growth, not, it's you have an extra runway that you can use the revenue coming in if you need to, but it's showing we can take this capital, maybe we need less capital than we would have needed in the past, and it can get you to the next phase, and then you can raise, a larger round having, the users and customers, revenue to back it up.
Hmm.
So I'd say that piece in terms of basically the business model, like less of the growth at all costs, except for there's still the mega rounds for like a smaller pool of companies that are getting funded, but the majority of, angel group, micro VC, like, smaller VC deals are more focused on um, can this business scale with, less than the typical capital in the past, and can it be maybe have multiple pathways to success between an acquisition all the way to an IPO, and yeah, so that, that's one of the big changes. And um, I'd say the other big change, and this is something I heard at our startup week last year, the founder of the rewards company Fetch was talking, and he was saying like they shifted like or now they run everything on um I'm not sure if it, OpenAI or AI backend. And one of the powerful things was every time there's an update there, their platform automatically gets better. And so, you know, companies are also making that decision of are we an AI company that's building our own infrastructure? Are we building on top of another foundational model, or are we just, using it in some capacity for like, marketing outreach and things like that, and deciding, when and where and telling that story um, as part of their presentations as well.
Yeah, that's good. So you are a wealth of information. And so if people want to stay connected to you on social media, where do you recommend they go?
Sure. Yeah, happy to connect on LinkedIn, or most of my social media like X or Instagram is either or it's J Kraus 23 on X and LinkedIn, and Jason Kraus 23 on Instagram. Happy to connect, and I also have a personal site too, jasonkraus.me. Um, and yeah, looking forward to connecting with everybody that took the time to listen to the show.
Awesome. Well, I will make sure that the links to that is in the show notes. And if you have a founder that is listening and they want to take the next step with you, what would that step be with them?
Sure. Yeah, so through Prepare for VC, we actually have a really great starting point called Compass, which is it starts with an assessment of your goals, where you are, and some personality characteristics, and then it helps you roadmap like basically from where you are today to where you want to go with your business, and gives recommendations on how to get there. Some of that is through our own support. We do one-on-one coaching. We have accelerator cohort programs. We're going to have one coming up in the fall that we're actively, taking applications and meeting founders for. And then, it also recommends like, are there other partners and community members and, people you should connect with too? And So I think that's always a great starting point for anybody that's listening.
And how do they access that?
Oh yeah. It's prepare for with the number four vc.com. And you'll see a button on there for Compass.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, Jason, thank you so much for being here today. I know that these nuggets are going to be a hit for the founders that are listening and everyone. I hope that you will share this episode far and wide, and that you will go back and listen to previous and future episodes as well. Everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.